came out to meet you. Of his great love that's been coming through. Of his great love that's been coming out to entreat you. Of his love that's been coming through. Can be your love or my love.
It's entertaining, it's funny, and it's relevant. Whether it's the environment or whatever it is, it's about survival. And survival is what we're talking about now. We're talking about global warming, and we're talking about the nuclear threats and everything else. It's about survival, but at the same time, it's about family. It's about love for each other. It's about all the things that keep us going. So, All About Us is really all about us.
Shalom, I am Rabbi Shaul Praver. You're watching Rabbi Rock. Today we have the great pleasure of being with playwright Joseph Stein. I'm sure you've heard of the play Fiddler on the Roof. Well, he's the writer of Fiddler on the Roof and many other fabulous plays which you'll recognize. And his current work is All About Us. It's a Kander and Ebb musical, and it's going to be opening up in April 14th. And with no further ado, I welcome Joseph Stein, playwright. Pleasure to be with you here today.
Very nice meeting you.
Tell us a little bit about your life growing up in New York City.
I was born in the Bronx, and we had a very typical simple neighborhood childhood.
Yeah.
My parents had come from the old country, and it was not the Bronx it is today. It was very homogeneous.
Mm-hmm.
I was one of 5 children. We were out on the street all the time. It was in short, it was a very happy and easy childhood. And subsequently, I went to high school in the Bronx and off to college.
You're most famous for your play Fiddler on the Roof, Zorba the Greek, The Baker's Wife, and Take Me Along. And you started out as a social worker. How did you find your way into playwriting?
I always had written. I was the editor of my school paper in high school and in college, and but I had never thought of myself as making a living as a writer necessarily.
Okay.
Although I always wanted to and would continue to write. So that when I went to college, I was trying to find something that would make me happy and I could earn a decent living.
Sure.
So I graduated as a social worker, and by accident or coincidence, whatever, I had lunch one day with a friend of mine, and among the people at that lunch at his home was somebody named Zero Mostel.
Wow.
Whom I had never met or even heard of. But at the time, he was doing a radio show and was supplying his own material. And that week he had run out of material. He was doing his own nightclub material. And I suggested something that he thought was interesting and amusing, and he said, "Why don't you write it out and I'll pay you for it?"
Wow.
So I did, and I remember vividly, he paid me $15, which I thought was found money, which I earned in one evening. And I found myself writing his material for the rest of the run in radio. And when that was over, the writer of the total show, of which that was a part, asked me if I wanted to work on another show.
Wow.
And I said I would be delighted to, continuing as a social worker. This was all in the evening.
I see.
And one thing led to another, and from that time I kept getting offers for shows in radio and then in television. So I gave up social worker at the social work profession and have been a writer ever since. And during that period, I worked for some of the most interesting, most pleasant, and most exciting shows in television.
Who were some of those?
Well, I worked for the Sid Caesar Show,
Wow.
and the Show of Shows, for about 4 years, and that was like a college in humor,
Mhm.
you know.
Sure.
And while I was on that show, the Sid Caesar Show, I was asked to write a musical, and that's how I got into writing for the theater.
Right.
Although at the same time, or prior to that, I wrote a play which was quite successful, called Enter Laughing.
Enter Laughing. Yes.
Yes, as that was my first Broadway show.
Fabulous.
And
Fabulous.
from there on, I remained in the theater, and I've been writing for the theater ever since.
Now, coming up through the ranks, who were your idols? Who influenced you in your writing? Who did you really admire?
Well, there are so many. Of course, you start with the giants like Ibsen and Shakespeare, of course. But in today's world, Arthur Miller was a major influence.
Yeah.
And there were so many.
Yeah. But Arthur Miller was a big one for you.
Arthur Miller was really
Yeah.
important when I first got into the theater.
Yeah.
So is plays like The Glass Menagerie.
Yes, yes, yes. Wow. Now, you wrote a play called Plain and Fancy, and it was about the Amish in Pennsylvania. And then years later, if I get it correct, that was an influence for you, writing Fiddler on the Roof.
That's not exactly right.
Okay.
I wrote Plain and Fancy, which was my very first musical.
Okay.
It's a rather curious story. A producer approached me through my agent, saying he'd like to write a musical about Pennsylvania, anything about Pennsylvania.
Oh, okay.
Because he had a lot of investors from Pennsylvania who were interested in writing.
I see.
And the only thing that intrigued me about Pennsylvania were the Pennsylvania Dutch.
Yeah.
And so I wrote a musical called Plain and Fancy about several sophisticated New Yorkers who come to that community and become involved with that community, and the conflicts between the cultures and so on.
Mm-hmm. Thus the plain and the fancy.
Yes, yes. The Amish call themselves the plain people.
Yeah.
Plain and Fancy has had a curious history. It was quite successful when it opened, and wasn't a big international hit or anything.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a theater in Indiana which has been playing that show for the last 25 years.
Is that right? Wow.
Consistently. Because it is a theater that's located in an Amish community is near there, so that tourists come all day long, and during the day they visit the Amish community. In the evening, they go to see the play, Plain and Fancy. At any rate, they asked me to write for the 25th anniversary. They asked me to write an introduction to their program. And as I was writing about Plain and Fancy, I thought about the interesting parallels between that show and Fiddler on the Roof, which had never occurred to me before.
Huh.
And Plain and Fancy is much more lighthearted. Fiddler on the Roof is much more serious, but it's basically about the conflict of cultures, the keeping of the tradition, the importance of the religion to the community, many other things which seem very similar.
Tell us about Fiddler on the Roof, The Baker's Wife, and Take Me Along.
These were all steps in my career. They're all shows that I wrote. Originally, I wrote shows that were suggested to me or were offered to me, but since Fiddler on the Roof, particularly, I only write shows that are important to me,
Mm-hmm.
that I feel are worth saying, that has something of value for the community. And I never think in terms of whether it's commercial or not, because the least commercial show I ever wrote, the least commercial, was Fiddler on the Roof. So some projects start from the outside,
Right.
like
Okay.
that,